The frozen wasteland of Kepler 442b stretched endlessly in every direction, a desolate expanse of crystalline ice formations and howling winds that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. Commander Sarah Chen pulled her thermal gear tighter around her body as she surveyed the crash site through her helmet's HUD display. The wreckage of the UES Prometheus lay scattered across the icy plain like the broken bones of some ancient beast, its hull cracked open and bleeding precious atmosphere into the alien night. 3 days had passed since the emergency landing, and already half of her crew was dead. The ship's life support systems had failed catastrophically during atmospheric entry, leaving the survivors with nothing but emergency suits and whatever supplies they could salvage from the wreckage. The temperature outside never rose above -60°C, even during what passed for daylight on this frozen hellworld. Sarah's breath fogged inside her helmet as she counted the remaining survivors. 12 souls, including herself, huddled around a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged hull plating and emergency thermal blankets. The shelter provided minimal protection from the elements, but it was better than facing the open ice. Their emergency beacon was broadcasting on all frequencies, but the nearest colony was 3 star systems away. Even at maximum FTL speed, a rescue ship would take weeks to reach them. Among the survivors was Zarahai, a member of the Veltar species that had recently joined the Galactic Coalition. The Veltar were a proud warrior race from a desert world where temperatures regularly exceeded 50°C. Their physiology was adapted for extreme heat, with specialized organs that regulated body temperature and skin that could absorb and store thermal energy. On their homeworld, they were apex predators. Here on Kepler 442b, Zarahai was slowly dying. Sarah watched the alien warrior with growing concern. Zarahai stood nearly 2 meters tall, with chitinous plates covering her arms and torso, and forearms that ended in razor-sharp claws. Her species was renowned throughout the galaxy for their combat prowess and unshakable honor code. Veltar warriors had never been known to retreat from battle or show weakness of any kind. Yet here, in the brutal cold of this alien world, even Zarahai's formidable constitution was failing. The alien's normally bronze-colored skin had taken on a sickly blue-gray hue, and her movements had become sluggish and uncoordinated. Her forearms, usually held with military precision, now trembled uncontrollably. Ice crystals had begun forming on the joints of her exoskeleton, creating hairline fractures that leaked precious body heat. Despite her proud nature, Sarah could see that Zarahai was suffering more than any of the human survivors. Dr. Marcus Webb, the ship's medical officer, had examined Zarahai on the first day after the crash. His diagnosis was grim. The Veltar physiology, so perfectly adapted for extreme heat, was completely unsuited for cold environments. Their circulatory system, designed to dissipate excess heat, was now working against them. Zarahai's core body temperature was dropping steadily, and, without intervention, she would enter a state of thermal shock within days. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The Veltar had initially been skeptical of humanity's inclusion in the Galactic Coalition. They viewed humans as physically weak and mentally unstable, too quick to panic in crisis situations. Veltar military doctrine emphasized individual strength and self-reliance above all else. The concept of depending on others for survival was foreign to their culture. Yet here they were, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Zarahai's survival depended entirely on the aid of the very species she had once considered inferior. As night fell on the 3rd day, the temperature plummeted even further. The shelter's improvised heating system, cobbled together from the ship's emergency power cells, struggled to maintain a livable temperature. The human survivors huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat beneath thermal blankets. Their breath created small clouds of vapor that quickly condensed and froze on the shelter's walls. Zarahai sat apart from the group, her forearms wrapped around her torso in a futile attempt to conserve heat. Her proud warrior's bearing was slowly crumbling as hypothermia set in. She had not spoken a word since the crash, maintaining the stoic silence that her culture demanded in the face of adversity. But Sarah could see the fear in her large, golden eyes. The human survivors had offered to share their warmth with her, but Zarahai had declined each time. Her honor code would not allow her to accept what she perceived as charity from a species she considered inferior. It was better to die with dignity than to live in debt to humans. Sarah made her decision as the shelter's temperature dropped below freezing. She couldn't stand by and watch Zarahai die, not when there was something she could do to help. Rising from her position near the heating unit, she grabbed her sleeping bag and moved toward the alien warrior. Zarahai's head turned sharply as Sarah approached. Her golden eyes, now dulled with cold and exhaustion, fixed on the human commander with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. When Sarah began unrolling her sleeping bag beside Zarahai's position, the alien's forearms tensed defensively. "What are you doing, human?" Zarahai's voice was barely a whisper, her vocal cords affected by the cold. Despite her weakened state, there was still a note of warning in her tone. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she began arranging the sleeping bag into a makeshift bed large enough for two. Her movements were deliberate and non-threatening, but purposeful. The other survivors watched with interest, understanding what their commander was attempting to do. "Saving your life," Sarah said simply as she finished her preparations. Body heat transfer is the most effective method of treating severe hypothermia in field conditions. "You're going to freeze to death if we don't get your core temperature up." Zarahai's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but was probably just the last vestiges of her warrior's pride. "I do not require assistance from humans. The Veltar are strong. We do not show weakness." Sarah met the alien's gaze steadily. "This isn't about strength or weakness. It's about survival. And, right now, survival means working together." The alien warrior was silent for a long moment, her forearms trembling more violently now. Ice crystals continued to form on her chitinous plates, and her breathing had become shallow and labored. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "If I accept your aid, I will be in your debt. Veltar honor demands that such debts be repaid." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what Zarahai was saying. In Veltar culture, being indebted to another was a serious matter that could affect one's standing in society for generations. But she also understood that without intervention, there would be no opportunity for repayment because Zarahai would be dead. "Then, consider it an investment in future cooperation between our species," Sarah said. "The coalition needs warriors like you. Losing you here would be a waste." It was a diplomatic way of framing the situation that allowed Zarahai to accept help without completely compromising her honor. The alien considered this for another moment, then slowly nodded her agreement. What followed was an awkward process of arranging themselves within the confines of the sleeping bag. Zarahai's forearms and larger frame made it a challenge, but eventually they managed to position themselves so that Sarah's smaller human body was pressed against the alien's torso, sharing vital body heat. The difference was immediately apparent. Zarahai's skin, which had felt cold as ice when Sarah first made contact, began to warm slightly. The violent trembling that had racked her body for hours gradually subsided. Her breathing became deeper and more regular as her core temperature stabilized. For Sarah, the experience was equally strange. Zarahai's alien physiology was fascinating to observe at close range. Her chitinous plates were smooth and warm to the touch, more like living armor than skin. Her forearms created a protective cocoon around Sarah's smaller frame, and, despite the alien's fearsome reputation, Sarah felt surprisingly safe. As the night wore on, they talked in quiet whispers. Zarahai spoke of her homeworld, Veltarun, where massive desert cities rose from seas of red sand and the twin suns never set. She described the honored duels that determined social ranking, the great hunts that marked the transition to adulthood, and the warrior codes that governed every aspect of Veltar society. Sarah, in turn, told Zarahai about Earth's diverse climates and ecosystems. She described snow-capped mountains and frozen lakes, concepts that were completely foreign to a being from a desert world. She explained how humans had adapted to survive in cold environments through technology and cooperation, working together to overcome natural challenges that would be impossible to face alone. "Your species is strange," Zarahai observed as Sarah finished describing an Arctic expedition she had participated in during her academy years. "You are individually weak, yet you accomplish things that should be impossible." Sarah smiled, though she knew Zarahai couldn't see it in the darkness. "That's because we don't try to do impossible things alone. We rely on each other." This concept was clearly difficult for Zarahai to understand. Veltar culture emphasized individual achievement and self-reliance. The idea that strength could come from cooperation rather than personal prowess was fundamentally alien to her worldview. On Veltarun, warriors who cannot survive alone are considered unfit, she said. They are cast out from society, left to die in the desert. Only the strong deserve to live. That's one way to look at it, Sarah acknowledged. But, what happens when the challenge is too great for any individual to overcome alone? What happens when survival requires more than personal strength? Zarahai was quiet for a long time, considering this question. Around them, the other survivors slept fitfully, occasionally stirring as the wind outside reached new levels of fury. The shelter's heating system hummed quietly, fighting a losing battle against the Arctic cold. I do not know, Zarahai finally admitted. This situation is beyond my experience. It was a remarkable admission from a proud Veltar warrior. Sarah understood that acknowledging uncertainty was probably as difficult for Zarahai as accepting human assistance had been. As the hours passed, their conversation gradually died away, replaced by a comfortable silence. Sarah could feel Zarahai's body temperature continuing to rise as her alien physiology absorbed the shared warmth. The warrior's breathing had returned to normal, and the trembling had stopped completely. But, more than just physical recovery was taking place. Sarah could sense a subtle shift in Zarahai's attitude, a crack in the rigid worldview that had governed her entire life. The proud warrior was being forced to confront the possibility that strength and survival might not always be the same thing. When morning came, such as it was on this frozen world, Zarahai was alive and stable. Her skin had returned to its normal bronze coloration, and her movements were once again precise and controlled. She carefully extricated herself from the sleeping bag, her forearms moving with their characteristic military efficiency. "You have my thanks, Commander Chen," she said formally, her voice strong and clear. "I am in your debt." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of this acknowledgement. "We're not out of danger yet. The rescue ship is still weeks away, and we need to conserve our resources if we're going to survive that long." It was true. Their food supplies were running low, the heating system was beginning to fail, and several of the other survivors were showing signs of cold-related injuries. The harsh reality was that their current survival strategies might not be sufficient for a long-term ordeal. Throughout the day, Sarah noticed changes in Zarahai's behavior. The alien warrior began observing the human survivors more closely, studying their cooperation and resource sharing with new interest. She watched as they organized work details, shared meals, and looked after the injured without any formal hierarchy or command structure. When one of the younger crew members, Ensign Rodriguez, developed frostbite on his hands, Zarahai was the first to notice. She alerted Dr. Webb immediately, and helped hold the ensign steady while the doctor treated the injury. It was a small gesture, but significant for a being who had been raised to believe that the weak should be left to fend for themselves. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop again, Sarah began preparing her sleeping area for another night of shared warmth. She had assumed that the arrangement would continue until Zarahai's physiology had fully adapted to the cold environment, or until rescue arrived. But, when darkness fell and the bitter cold began to seep through the shelter's walls, Sarah found herself alone. Zarahai had positioned herself on the opposite side of the shelter, her forearms wrapped around her torso in the same defensive posture she had maintained on the first night. Sarah watched with growing concern as the familiar signs of hypothermia began to manifest in the alien warrior. The trembling returned, along with the blue-gray discoloration of her skin. Ice crystals began forming on her chitinous plates once again. She approached Zarahai carefully, uncertain of the alien's motivations. "Your core temperature is dropping again. You need to maintain body heat if you're going to survive the night." Zarahai looked up at her with those large golden eyes, and Sarah was surprised to see confusion rather than pride reflected there. "I do not understand what is happening to me, Commander Chen. Last night, sharing warmth with you, I felt different. Not just physically, but mentally. It was as if something fundamental had changed." Sarah knelt beside the alien warrior, beginning to understand the deeper implications of their situation. "What kind of change?" I have been trained since childhood to rely only on myself, to trust only in my own strength and abilities. But, last night, depending on you for survival, I felt something I have never experienced before. Zarahai paused, struggling to find words for concepts that didn't exist in her native language. Security. Safety. Not because of my own power, but because of yours. It was a profound revelation for a being raised in a culture that equated independence with worth. Sarah realized that Zarahai was experiencing something completely foreign to her species, the psychological comfort that came from mutual dependence and trust. Is that why you're trying to stay warm on your own tonight? Sarah asked gently. Because you're afraid of that feeling? Zarahai nodded slowly. On Veltarun, such feelings are considered weakness. A warrior who depends on others is no warrior at all. But, here, in this place, I begin to understand that your human concepts of strength and weakness may be different from ours. Sarah smiled and began unrolling her sleeping bag once again. Strength isn't about what you can do alone, Zarahai. It's about what you're willing to do for others, and what you're willing to let others do for you. Trust is a form of courage, not weakness. This time, Zarahai didn't hesitate. She helped Sarah arrange the sleeping bag, and settled beside her with something that might have been relief. As their bodies pressed together and shared warmth began to flow between them, Zarahai spoke again. Tell me more about human cooperation, she requested. I want to understand how your species became strong through weakness. Sarah laughed softly. We didn't become strong through weakness. We became strong through understanding that no one is strong enough to face everything alone. Even the mightiest human needs help sometimes. As the night progressed, Sarah continued to educate Zarahai about human social structures and survival strategies. She explained how humans had conquered hostile environments not through individual prowess, but through collective effort and shared knowledge. She described how human society had evolved to support its weakest members rather than abandon them, and how this had ultimately made the entire species stronger. For Zarahai, these concepts were revolutionary. Her entire worldview had been built on the assumption that individual strength was the only thing that mattered. The idea that collective weakness could become collective strength challenged everything she had been taught. Your species is more complex than I initially believed, she admitted as Sarah finished describing humanity's expansion into space. Perhaps the Veltar have been incomplete in our understanding. It was as close to an apology as Sarah was likely to get from a proud Veltar warrior, and she accepted it graciously. More importantly, she could sense that Zarahai was beginning to genuinely understand the value of cooperation and mutual dependence. As they settled into sleep, Zarahai made a quiet observation that would prove to be prophetic. I think, Commander Chen, that if we survive this ordeal, it will change both of our species' understanding of strength and survival. Sarah agreed, though she couldn't have predicted just how profound those changes would be. The seventh day brought a new crisis that would test everything Zarahai had learned about human cooperation and survival. A massive ice storm had been building on the horizon for hours, its towering walls of wind and snow visible even through the shelter's small observation port. Dr. Webb's weather instruments, salvaged from the crashed ship, indicated that the approaching storm would bring temperatures down to -80°C, with wind speeds exceeding 200 km per hour. Sarah gathered the survivors for an emergency meeting as the first wisps of ice-laden wind began to rattle their makeshift shelter. The assembled group looked haggard and worn, their faces gaunt from rationed meals and their eyes hollow with exhaustion. But they were alive, and that was more than could be said for the crew members they had lost in those first chaotic hours after the crash. Our current shelter won't survive what's coming, Sarah announced without preamble. The storm will tear it apart and bury us under several meters of snow. We need to find better protection, and we need to find it fast. Engineer Lieutenant Torres had been studying the wreckage of the Prometheus since the crash, looking for ways to salvage useful equipment. He stepped forward with a datapad displaying structural diagrams of the ship's remaining sections. There's a section of the cargo hold that's still relatively intact, he reported. If we can clear out the debris and seal the breaches, it might provide adequate shelter. But it would require moving all of our supplies and equipment before the storm hits. We have maybe 6 hours. 6 hours to dismantle their current shelter, transport everything across 300 meters of treacherous ice, and reconstruct a livable space inside the wreckage. It was a monumental task for 12 exhausted survivors, several of whom were suffering from cold-related injuries. Sarah looked around the group, gauging their physical condition and morale. Ensign Rodriguez's frostbitten hands were bandaged and largely useless for manual labor. Chief Petty Officer Kim was fighting off the early stages of hypothermia despite their best efforts to keep him warm. 2 other crew members were suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have asked for volunteers for the most dangerous tasks while keeping the injured crew members in relative safety. But these weren't normal circumstances, and they couldn't afford to leave anyone behind. Zarahai had been listening to the discussion with growing intensity. Her forearms were crossed in front of her chest, and her golden eyes moved from one human face to another as she evaluated their condition. Finally, she stepped forward into the center of the group. "I will carry the heavy equipment," she announced in her precise, formal manner of speaking. "My physical strength is greater than any single human. It will be more efficient." It was a practical suggestion, but Sarah could see something deeper in Zarahai's offer. The alien warrior was volunteering to take on the most physically demanding and dangerous aspects of the operation, not because her honor code required it, but because she understood that it would help the group survive. "That's a good start," Sarah acknowledged, "but we're going to need more than individual strength to pull this off. We need coordination and teamwork." What followed was a masterclass in human organizational ability. Sarah divided the survivors into teams based on their capabilities and the tasks that needed to be completed. The injured crew members were assigned to sorting and packing supplies, work that could be done from a seated position inside the shelter. The more mobile survivors were tasked with transportation and construction. Zarahai found herself paired with Torres and 2 other crew members for the heavy lifting team. Her initial instinct was to work independently, using her superior strength to accomplish tasks as quickly as possible. But Sarah had specifically instructed the teams to work together, with no one person taking on more than they could safely handle. "I can carry this entire supply crate alone," Zarahai protested as Torres moved to help her lift a container of emergency rations. "There is no need for your assistance." Torres smiled grimly, his breath creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. "Maybe you can, but what happens if you slip on the ice and hurt yourself? Then, we lose both the supplies and our strongest team member. 2 people carrying 1 crate is safer than 1 person carrying 2 crates." It was another lesson in human thinking that challenged Zarahai's assumptions about strength and efficiency. On Veltarun, the strongest warrior would naturally take on the heaviest burdens, demonstrating their superiority over weaker individuals. The concept of deliberately limiting one's individual contribution for the sake of group safety was foreign to her. But, as they began the dangerous journey across the ice field to the crashed cargo hold, Zarahai began to understand the wisdom of the human approach. The surface was treacherous, covered with a thin layer of snow that concealed jagged ice formations and hidden crevices. More than once, her partner's warning saved her from a potentially serious fall. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Each trip across the icefield required careful navigation around debris from the crashed ship, and the rising wind made every step treacherous. The human crew members moved slowly and methodically, helping each other over difficult terrain and sharing the burden of heavy equipment. Zarahai watched this process with fascination. In Veltar society, such cooperation would have been seen as evidence of individual weakness. But, here, she could see that it was actually making the group stronger and more efficient. No one was pushing themselves beyond their limits, which meant no one was likely to collapse or make dangerous mistakes due to exhaustion. Halfway through the operation, disaster struck. Chief Kim, who had been struggling with hypothermia, collapsed while carrying a container of medical supplies. The container broke open when it hit the ice, scattering precious medications and equipment across the frozen ground. On Veltarun, such an incident would have resulted in Kim being abandoned to his fate while the stronger members of the group continued their mission. Individual failure was considered a sign of unfitness, and those who couldn't keep up were left behind without hesitation. But Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. She called for a temporary halt to the operation while Dr. Webb attended to Kim's condition. Meanwhile, other crew members carefully collected the scattered medical supplies, checking each item for damage and salvaging what they could. Zarahai knelt beside Sarah as the human commander helped gather fallen medication containers. "You are risking the mission for one individual who has already proven his weakness," she observed. "This does not seem logical." Sarah looked up at her with those steady blue eyes that had become so familiar over the past week. "Kim isn't weak, Zarahai. He's sick. And sick people can get better if they're given proper care and support. Abandoning him now would be like throwing away a valuable crew member just because he's temporarily unable to contribute." The alien warrior considered this as they continued collecting the scattered supplies. On her homeworld, individuals who became sick or injured were expected to either recover quickly or remove themselves from society so as not to burden others. The idea of actively supporting someone through a period of weakness was not just foreign to her culture, it was actively discouraged. "But what if he does not recover?" Zarahai asked. "What if his condition worsens and he becomes a permanent burden on the group?" Sarah paused in her work, a small vial of antibiotics clutched in her gloved hand. "Then, we'll carry that burden together, because that's what communities do. We take care of each other, not because it's always efficient or logical, but because it's right." Dr. Webb's examination revealed that Kim was suffering from severe hypothermia compounded by exhaustion and dehydration. With proper treatment and rest, he could recover, but he would be unable to contribute to the shelter construction for at least 24 hours. The logical response, from a purely practical standpoint, would have been to leave Kim in the old shelter with minimal supplies while the rest of the group focused on building the new one. It would have been safer and more efficient, and it would have conserved resources that the group could ill afford to waste. Instead, Sarah made the decision to modify their plans. 2 crew members would stay with Kim to monitor his condition and help him when he was strong enough to make the journey. The remaining team would continue with the shelter construction, but they would make multiple trips to transport Kim safely when he was ready to move. Zarahai volunteered to be one of the crew members who stayed behind. It was an offer that surprised everyone, including herself. Her warrior instincts told her to focus on the mission-critical tasks that would ensure the group's survival. Staying behind to care for a sick human served no practical purpose from a Veltar perspective. But something had changed in her thinking over the past week. The nightly sharing of warmth with Sarah had created a bond that went beyond simple survival necessity. More than that, it had opened her mind to new ways of thinking about strength, community, and mutual dependence. "I will remain with Kim," she announced. "My body heat will help maintain his core temperature, and my strength will be available to carry him when he is ready to move." Sarah nodded approvingly, but Zarahai could see the questions in her eyes. The human commander was trying to understand the alien warrior's motivations, just as Zarahai was trying to understand her own. The next several hours were a test of endurance for both species. The construction team worked frantically to seal the cargo hold and make it habitable before the storm arrived. Meanwhile, Zarahai found herself in the unfamiliar position of caring for a sick individual who could offer nothing in return. Kim drifted in and out of consciousness as his body fought to stabilize his core temperature. During his lucid moments, he was apologetic and embarrassed about his condition, clearly feeling guilty about being a burden on the group. Zarahai found herself offering reassurance, something she had never done before in her life. "Rest and recover," she told him in her precise English. "Your survival benefits the entire group. We are stronger together than we are individually." The words felt strange coming from her mouth, concepts that would have been considered heretical on Veltarun. But they also felt true in a way that her traditional warrior teachings never had. She was beginning to understand that strength could take many forms, and that survival often required sacrificing individual glory for collective benefit. As the storm finally arrived with all its predicted fury, the survivors huddled together in their new shelter within the cargo hold. The reinforced hull provided much better protection than their previous arrangement, and the larger space allowed them to organize their supplies more efficiently. But the real test came as the temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl with supernatural intensity. Even inside the shelter, the cold was brutal, threatening to overwhelm their improvised heating system and freeze them all to death. It was then that Zarahai made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. Instead of maintaining her individual sleeping area, she helped organize the entire group into a single communal sleeping arrangement designed to maximize shared body heat. The humans called it a human pile, and, while the term was somewhat undignified, the concept was remarkably effective. By clustering together under shared blankets and sleeping bags, they could pool their body heat and maintain a survivable temperature even in the brutal cold. Zarahai found herself at the center of the arrangement, her larger body and higher natural temperature making her an ideal heat source for the smaller humans. Her forearms created natural spaces for others to nestle against her chitinous plates, and her alien physiology proved surprisingly compatible with human thermal regulation. As the storm raged outside and the survivors settled into their shared warmth, conversations began to flow naturally. Stories were shared, fears were acknowledged, and hopes for rescue were discussed openly. It was an intimate experience that went far beyond simple survival necessity. Dr. Webb talked about his research into xenobiology and his fascination with the different ways that various species had adapted to extreme environments. Torres described his family back on Earth and his plans for retirement from space service. Even Kim, still weak from his hypothermic episode, contributed tales of his childhood on Mars colony. When it was Zarahai's turn to share, she found herself talking about subjects she had never discussed with outsiders before. She described the loneliness of Veltar warrior culture, where individual strength was prized above all else but meaningful connections with others were seen as weakness. She talked about the pressure to constantly prove oneself worthy of survival, and the fear of showing any vulnerability that might be interpreted as unfitness. "I have spent my entire life trying to be strong enough to survive alone," she admitted as the storm continued to rage around them. "But this experience has taught me that being strong enough to survive with others may be more valuable." Sarah, pressed against Zarahai's side in the communal sleeping arrangement, smiled at this revelation. "That's what we call evolution, Zarahai. Not just biological adaptation, but cultural and social growth. Learning new ways to be strong." The alien warrior was quiet for a moment, considering this concept. If survival requires community, and community requires trust, then trust must also be a form of strength. It was a profound realization for a being raised in a culture that equated trust with weakness. But, as Zarahai felt the steady breathing of the humans pressed against her, drawing warmth and comfort from her presence just as she drew psychological security from theirs, she began to understand that strength and vulnerability were not mutually exclusive. The storm continued for 18 hours, and, when it finally passed, the survivors emerged to find their world completely transformed. Snowdrifts several meters high surrounded their shelter, and the wreckage of their original camp had been completely buried. If they had remained in their first shelter, they would all have frozen to death. But they had survived, not through individual heroics or superior technology, but through cooperation and mutual support. The Veltar warrior who had once believed that strength meant standing alone had learned that true strength sometimes meant being willing to lean on others. As they began the work of digging out their equipment and re-establishing communications, Zarahai made a quiet observation to Sarah. "When we are rescued and return to civilization, I believe I will have much to teach my people about the nature of strength and survival." Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Zarahai was suggesting. A Veltar warrior returning home with stories of successful cooperation with inferior humans would challenge the fundamental assumptions of her entire culture. Change is never easy, Sarah acknowledged, but sometimes it's necessary for survival. As they worked together to clear snow and debris, Zarahai reflected on how much she had changed in just over a week. The proud, solitary warrior who had crashed on this frozen world no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that true strength came not from independence, but from the courage to depend on others and allow others to depend on you. The rescue beacon was still broadcasting, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, help was coming. But Zarahai knew that when that rescue ship finally arrived, it would be picking up a very different group of survivors than the ones who had crashed on this frozen world. They had all been changed by their experience, and those changes would ripple outward to affect their entire species' understanding of strength, survival, and what it meant to be truly alive. 23 days after the crash, the rescue ship UES Meridian dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Captain Rodriguez, no relation to the young ensign stranded on the planet's surface, immediately ordered maximum acceleration toward the frozen world where 12 survivors waited for salvation. The rescue had taken longer than expected due to a series of bureaucratic complications. The Veltar military command had initially insisted that their warrior be recovered by a Veltar vessel, claiming that human rescue protocols were inadequate for their species' needs. It had taken direct intervention by the Coalition Council to override their objections and allow the closest available ship to proceed with the mission. During those extra days of delay, the survivors on Kepler 442b had faced new challenges that tested everything they had learned about cooperation and mutual dependence. Their food supplies had dwindled to dangerously low levels, forcing them to implement strict rationing that left everyone constantly hungry. The heating system had failed completely during the second week, leaving them dependent entirely on shared body heat for survival. But, perhaps most significantly, Chief Kim had developed a severe respiratory infection that threatened to spread to the other survivors in their confined living space. Dr. Webb's medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and, without proper treatment facilities, the infection could easily prove fatal. It was during this crisis that Zarahai made the most difficult decision of her life. On the 19th day, as Kim's condition worsened and his fever spiked dangerously high, she approached Sarah with a proposal that would have been unthinkable in traditional Veltar culture. "I want to share my blood with him," Zarahai announced without preamble. "My immune system is more robust than human physiology. My blood contains antibodies that might help him fight the infection." Dr. Webb looked up from where he was monitoring Kim's vital signs. "That's incredibly dangerous, Zarahai. Our species have completely different biochemistry. A direct blood transfusion could kill both of you." Zarahai's forearms gestured dismissively. "Then, we will modify the approach. Extract the antibodies from my blood and synthesize them for human compatibility. You have the equipment for basic biochemical analysis." It was true that they had salvaged some medical equipment from the crashed ship, but performing xenobiological blood synthesis under field conditions was far beyond anything they had attempted before. The procedure would require precise temperature control, sterile conditions, and sophisticated chemical processing equipment that they simply didn't have. "Even if we could extract the antibodies," Dr. Webb continued, "we have no way to test their compatibility with human physiology. We could be injecting Kim with a substance that would trigger a fatal allergic reaction." Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding of what Zarahai was really proposing. The alien warrior wasn't just offering to help Kim medically, she was volunteering to risk her own life for someone who could offer nothing in return. It was the ultimate expression of the cooperative philosophy she had learned during their time together. "There might be another way," Sarah said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. "What if we don't try to synthesize the antibodies directly? What if we create a controlled exposure situation that allows Kim's immune system to learn from yours?" Dr. Webb frowned, trying to understand what she was suggesting. "You mean some kind of limited biological exchange? That's still incredibly risky." "Less risky than watching him die," Zarahai pointed out. "And less risky than a direct transfusion. If we can find a way to expose his immune system to mine in a controlled manner, it might stimulate his natural defenses without overwhelming his system." What followed was 12 hours of intense medical consultation and preparation. Using the limited equipment available, Dr. Webb devised a procedure that would involve extracting small amounts of Zarahai's blood, processing it to remove the most dangerous foreign elements, and then introducing trace amounts into Kim's system through a series of carefully monitored injections. It was an experimental procedure with no guarantee of success and significant risk of complications. But, as Kim's condition continued to deteriorate, it represented their best hope of saving his life. The actual procedure took place in the early hours of the 20th day, with the entire group of survivors participating in various support roles. Zarahai lay on a makeshift medical table constructed from salvaged equipment, her forearms extended as Dr. Webb carefully extracted blood samples from her primary circulatory system. The alien warrior's blood was unlike anything Dr. Webb had ever seen. It had a bronze-colored tint and contained cellular structures that were completely foreign to human physiology. Under the microscope, he could see specialized immune cells that seemed to actively hunt and destroy infectious agents with remarkable efficiency. Your people's immune systems are like biological warfare machines, he observed as he worked to isolate the relevant antibody structures. No wonder Veltar rarely gets sick. Zarahai managed a weak smile from her position on the table. Desert worlds are harsh environments. Only those with strong immune systems survive to reproduce. But this is the first time I have considered using that strength to help another species. The processing work was delicate and time-consuming. Dr. Webb had to carefully separate Zarahai's antibodies from the cellular components that would be incompatible with human blood chemistry. Meanwhile, Sarah and the other survivors maintained a careful watch on both patients, monitoring their vital signs and providing whatever support they could. When the first injection was finally ready, the tension in the shelter was palpable. Everyone understood that they were attempting something that had never been tried before, with the life of a crew member hanging in the balance. Kim was barely conscious as Dr. Webb administered the injection, his fever having spiked to dangerous levels during the night. His breathing was labored and his pulse was weak, clear signs that his body was losing its fight against the infection. The first few hours after the injection were agonizing. Kim's condition seemed to worsen initially as his immune system reacted to the foreign antibodies. His fever climbed even higher, and he began experiencing convulsions that required constant monitoring to prevent injury. But then, slowly, his condition began to stabilize. His fever started to come down, and his breathing became easier. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the experimental treatment was working. Dr. Webb administered 2 more injections over the following days, each time using antibodies extracted from Zarahai's blood. The alien warrior bore the repeated blood draws without complaint, even though they left her increasingly weak and exhausted. By the 22nd day, Kim was sitting up and taking solid food for the first time in a week. His infection had been completely eliminated, and his strength was returning rapidly. The experimental treatment had been a complete success. But the real significance of what had happened went far beyond the medical achievement. Zarahai had voluntarily weakened herself to save the life of a human crew member, demonstrating a level of selfless cooperation that would have been impossible under traditional Veltar cultural values. "You could have died," Kim told her as he recovered his strength. "The blood loss alone could have killed you in these conditions. Why did you take such a risk for me?" Zarahai considered the question carefully before answering. "Because your survival makes all of us stronger. Because a community that abandons its sick members is not truly strong, no matter how physically powerful its individual members might be." It was a complete reversal of everything she had been taught about strength and survival. The warrior who had once believed that individual prowess was the only thing that mattered now understood that true strength came from the willingness to sacrifice for others. When the rescue ship finally arrived on the 23rd day, it found a group of survivors who had been fundamentally transformed by their experience. The humans had learned to appreciate the value of diverse perspectives and capabilities, while Zarahai had discovered that cooperation could be a form of strength rather than weakness. The rescue operation itself went smoothly, with the Meridian's medical team providing immediate treatment for cold-related injuries and malnutrition. But Captain Rodriguez was surprised by what he observed during the evacuation process. Instead of the traditional Veltar behavior of maintaining individual dignity and refusing assistance, Zarahai actively helped coordinate the rescue of the human crew members. She used her superior strength to carry injured survivors to the transport shuttles, and she insisted that the humans receive medical attention before herself. "That's unusual behavior for a Veltar warrior," Captain Rodriguez observed to Sarah as they watched the evacuation proceed. "Normally they're very focused on individual status and hierarchy." Sarah smiled as she watched Zarahai gently help Kim into a transport shuttle. "She's learned some new things about what it means to be strong. I think it's going to change her people's understanding of survival and cooperation." The journey back to Coalition space took 3 days, during which the survivors underwent extensive medical examinations and psychological evaluations. The medical team was particularly interested in the experimental antibody treatment that had saved Kim's life, as it represented a potential breakthrough in cross-species medical cooperation. But it was the psychological evaluations that revealed the most significant changes. The human survivors showed remarkably high levels of group cohesion and mutual trust, far beyond what would normally be expected after a traumatic survival situation. They had learned to function as a true team, with each member contributing their unique capabilities for the benefit of the whole. Zarahai's evaluation was even more remarkable. Veltar's psychological baselines typically showed strong individual identity markers and low cooperation indices. But her post-rescue evaluation indicated a fundamental shift toward collective thinking and mutual dependence. "I no longer believe that individual strength is the highest virtue," she explained to the coalition psychologist conducting her evaluation. "I have learned that survival often requires the courage to depend on others and to allow others to depend on you. This is not weakness, as my people have traditionally believed. It is a different kind of strength." The implications of this revelation extended far beyond Zarahai's personal transformation. As one of the first Veltar warriors to undergo extended survival cooperation with humans, her experiences would be studied extensively by xenosociologists and military strategists throughout Coalition space. When they finally arrived at the Coalition medical station at Proxima Centauri, Zarahai faced a difficult decision. Veltar military protocol required that she report immediately to her commanding officers for debriefing and reassignment. But she had also been invited to participate in a joint human-Veltar research project studying cross-species survival cooperation. The choice represented more than just a career decision. It was a fundamental choice between her old life as a traditional Veltar warrior and a new path that would require her to challenge everything her culture believed about strength and survival. Sarah found her in the station's observation lounge on their final night together, staring out at the stars through the massive viewport. The alien warrior looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she had during their time on the frozen planet. "Having second thoughts?" Sarah asked as she joined Zarahai at the viewport. "I am considering the consequences of what I have learned," Zarahai replied. "If I return to Veltaron and share these experiences, I will be challenging fundamental aspects of our culture. Many of my people will see it as betrayal of our warrior traditions." Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Zarahai was contemplating. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges deeply held beliefs. But sometimes it's necessary for survival. "The irony is not lost on me," Zarahai said with something that might have been amusement. "I learned about cooperation by depending on humans for survival. Now I must choose whether to cooperate with humans to teach my people about the value of cooperation." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the stars while slowly past the viewport. Finally, Zarahai spoke again. "I have decided to accept the research position. My people need to learn what I have learned, even if they initially resist the knowledge. The Veltar are strong individually, but we could be stronger as part of a true cooperative community." Sarah smiled, though she wasn't surprised by the decision. Over the past 3 weeks, she had watched Zarahai transform from a proud, isolated warrior into someone who understood the value of mutual dependence and trust. "I think you're going to change both our species' understanding of what it means to be strong," Sarah said. "Perhaps," Zarahai agreed. "But first, I want to ensure that you and your crew receive proper recognition for what you accomplished on that frozen world. Without your cooperation and willingness to share survival resources, none of us would have survived." It was a generous acknowledgement from a warrior whose culture traditionally gave credit only to individual achievement. But Zarahai had learned that true strength often meant recognizing the contributions of others. The next morning, as Sarah prepared to return to Earth for reassignment, Zarahai made one final gesture that summarized everything she had learned about cooperation and mutual dependence. "I want to give you this," she said, presenting Sarah with a small medallion made from one of her own chitinous plates. In Veltar culture, warriors exchange pieces of their armor only with their closest battle companions. It signifies a bond that transcends individual survival. Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, understanding its significance. "What does this mean for us going forward?" It means that no matter where our careers take us, we will always be connected by what we shared on that frozen world. We learn to survive together, and that bond cannot be broken by distance or time. As Sarah's transport ship prepared to depart, she looked back at the medical station where Zarahai would be beginning her new research career. The alien warrior was already meeting with human scientists, sharing her knowledge and perspectives in the spirit of cooperation that had saved all their lives. 6 months later, the first joint human-Veltar survival training program was established at the Coalition Military Academy. The program was based on the experiences of the Kepler 442b survivors, and it emphasized cooperation, mutual dependence, and cross-species trust as essential survival skills. Zarahai served as the primary Veltar instructor for the program, teaching young warriors from both species that true strength came not from individual prowess, but from the courage to depend on others and allow others to depend on you. Her students initially struggled with concepts that challenged their traditional understanding of strength and weakness, but gradually they began to understand that cooperation could be a form of courage rather than weakness. The program's motto, suggested by Zarahai herself, summarized everything they had learned during those desperate weeks on the frozen planet. In darkness, we find each other. In cold, we share warmth. In weakness, we discover strength. Sarah, now serving as the human coordinator for the program, often reflected on how much their lives had been changed by that crash on Kepler 442b. What had begun as a disaster had become a profound learning experience that would influence military and survival doctrine for generations to come. But, perhaps most importantly, it had proven that the barriers between species were not as insurmountable as they had once believed. With courage, cooperation, and mutual respect, even the most fundamental cultural differences could be overcome. The nighttime sharing of warmth in a survival shelter had become a symbol of how different species could learn to depend on each other for survival. And, in the vast darkness of space, where countless challenges awaited humanity and its alien allies, that lesson would prove to be one of the most valuable discoveries of all. After dark, when the training exercises were complete and the students had returned to their quarters, Zarahai would sometimes stand at the observation windows and remember those desperate nights on the frozen planet. She would remember the warmth of human trust, the strength that came from admitting weakness, and the courage required to depend on someone from another species for survival. Those memories had changed her understanding of what it meant to be strong, and, through her teaching, they would change an entire generation's approach to cooperation and survival. The proud Veltar warrior had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came from the willingness to whisper into the darkness, "I cannot survive without your warmth," and trust that someone would answer with their own vulnerable admission of need. In the end, survival was not about individual strength or superior technology. It was about the courage to reach across the vast differences between species and find common ground in shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. It was about learning that true strength sometimes meant being strong enough to be weak, and wise enough to know that in the darkness of space, no one could survive alone.